This week, malware in the cloud, next generation AV bundled with endpoint protection, AI-powered UEBA threat hunting, ranking security vendors, and don't believe the hype, surveys and data analysis. John and I will also cover some tips for configuration management, all that and more on this edition of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Practice field, I had to do that to the door, and then once the wind caught it, I flew outside the door.
That's so good. I call that a programmer's workout.
Yes, that is a programmer's workout.
I was at RSA. I got out. I have seen things. I've seen horrible things.
Gain control of cyber risk with Tenable.io, the first vulnerability management platform built for today's elastic assets like cloud, containers, and web apps. Discover a fresh, asset-based approach that prioritizes vulnerabilities while seamlessly integrating into your environment. And improve ROI with the first elastic licensing approach based on assets, not IP addresses. Tenable.io delivers the data and context you need to secure your elastic attack surface. Start your free Tenable.io trial today by visiting Tenable.io. Waterfall Security Solutions, the market leader in unidirectional gateway technology. Their industrial cybersecurity technology protects critical infrastructure and control systems from remote online cyber attacks. It's installed around the world, including nuclear plants in the US and electric grids. Their unidirectional security gateway creates an impassable physical barrier preventing communications from flowing into industrial control networks, enabling safe and secure IT and OT integration, remote monitoring, and cloud services. Visit securityweekly.com/SCADA. The first 100 listeners who register will receive a free copy of SCADA Security, What's Broken and How to Fix It, written by Waterfall's VP of Industrial Security, Andrew Ginter. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode 38 for March 30th, 2017. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined on the lines via Skype by Mr. John Strand. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sitting here at the floor at BHIS offices and getting ready to drive across the state to DakotaCon.
Oh, nice. That's where you're headed. So you haven't gotten chairs yet?
No, we do have chairs, but I need to be tethered to a specific never mind. I guess I could be sitting in a chair, but I prefer to sit here on the floor today.
But then I wouldn't have a table.
Yeah.
Just a really quick announcement. The 10th anniversary edition of Source Boston is going to be held this April, including training sessions on April 24th through the 25th and conference talks on April 26th through the 27th, featuring some awesome speakers and some really awesome training as well. Events are going to take place in Boston at the Courtyard Marriott downtown. Security Weekly listeners get a $100 discount on either training or conference passes when using the code Security Weekly. Visit sourceconference.com for more information. So, first up, we've got some enterprise security news. John.
Very cool.
Are you ready for this week?
I am.
I am. They were few, but they were epic articles that I found this week. First, the cure for infectious malware. And this is from, is it BitGlass? And I saw them at Secure World Boston. I didn't get a chance to catch up with them. However, their problem they're trying to address is malware in the cloud, which I don't know if that's like a hot button thing that I would necessarily lead with.
Yeah.
I'm sure I don't want to say it's not a problem. I'm just not educated enough on the problem of malware in the cloud. Certainly, I think we've talked about ransomware that can reach out and encrypt your cloud data. But malware in the cloud doesn't really resonate with me as an issue right now. I think maybe they're ahead of their time, perhaps, but they have advanced threat protection, which is a core component of their cloud access security broker. So organizations can protect the cloud from malware before it hits the app. assess the risk of any one file, and stop malicious attacks in their tracks. What's your take on this, John?
I think this is actually pretty cool, specifically with the vendors that they talk about whenever you're dealing with G Suite, Office 365, Azure. And when you're talking about malware in the cloud, most of the time what you're discussing is malware that goes into like your email provider, your cloud-based email provider, or if you're storing files in the cloud, you have files that are being stored there as well. Now, a lot of those vendors like G Suite and Office 365 have built-in antivirus, and that's great. But I think adding in another layer of protection for those particular files is actually really, really quite cool. But like you said, is it something that's like a hot button issue? Not at the moment, but this could either be something that's very big over the next 12 months, or this is just something they're trying to create buzz around something that isn't that interesting quite yet.
I know, but my G Suite antivirus scanner has never found anything.
Ever?
I don't know. I haven't purposely tried to upload malware to it, though. Maybe that's something we should look at.
You should. We've created some malware. We've uploaded it to our Google Drive, and it's out on the Google Drive for about 10, 12 months, and then finally it would catch it and say this file's malicious and it's been deleted. So we've actually seen it work in the past. Also, Dropbox does it periodically. We'll host malware up on Dropbox, share it with customers or students or things like that. And sometimes Dropbox will restrict access to files, but it's very infrequent.
Yeah.
And I think that this kind of shows how little protection there is in the cloud, and I think that BitGlass, there's definitely something there. Whether or not it's a big deal or not, we'll have to see.
Awesome. enSilo adds next-generation antivirus to support redundant security and remediation expenditures. I can't really figure out what it is that enSilo does that they do better than any other endpoint vendor. They said they've redefined endpoint security, and they've expanded their platform to include a next-generation antivirus inside of their product, which is an interesting take, different from some other endpoint providers like Cylance that just basically say, run us and nothing else. enSilo is including the AV inside of their product. They say it's the first line of defense, blah, 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 blah. They also, in their announcement, which I thought was probably the most interesting thing, is that they support Linux-based operating systems on production servers, which is kind of interesting. I don't see a whole lot of that in the endpoint protection space, but good to know that Linux and other such OSs are getting love outside of Windows.
Absolutely. And this is kind of one of the themes that I think we're going to see on the show today is this idea of next generation endpoint security or next generation AV. A lot of this stuff isn't nearly as good as the hype makes it out to be, at least not yet. I think it's a step in the right direction, but you got to watch out for the hype. Now, the one that is interesting in here is if you actually do look at enSilo, the idea that it kind of combines antivirus with post-infection data protection and collection information as far as incident response, I think that's really cool. And Paul, we've seen this with a number of vendors with that automated incident response starting to come on the scene a little bit more, and I think that that's really cool. The more information you can give an incident responder, the more information you can give a security professional is always the best course of action. So we'll have to see. I haven't played with their product. I don't see anything in this that makes me think that their product is doing something completely revolutionary compared to like a Cylance or a CrowdStrike or Binary, whoever it is that's out there.
So it's interesting how I think it could be because we've gotten, well, a couple of reasons. There's more malware, more devices, right? And so that's one thing. There's also, I think, better detection mechanisms that work kind of in a more automated fashion that is driving what you were talking about before, John, that automated response. So it's almost like because there's more bad things, and I truly believe we've increased our ability to detect bad things even faster, that now it's pushing it to say, okay, well, now we're in a situation where we can't respond to it. It takes too long to respond, so we get this thing of automated response. I think it's the next natural progression of technology in our industry. I think it's kind of a buzzword right now, but I find a lot of organizations are asking me and others specifically, like, okay, what do I do to get better at incident response and put automation into that process?
Yep, very true.
All right, AI-powered UEBA threat hunting. This one now ForScale could have a great product. Don't get me wrong. I have not tested ForScale's product. If you're using ForScale and it's working for you, send us a note. I want to hear from you. I think it's more about picking apart their marketing, that if it is a good product, that is doing it a disservice because in their marketing literature, John, they say ForScale's engine combines automated enrichment, sophisticated machine learning algorithms, accurate anomaly detection, threat classification, and incident aggregation in one box. So this is like a all-in-one solution.
Oh, look, we love the idea of threat hunting, and user behavioral analytics is one of the coolest things out there that I think is really what we should be talking about. How can we actually do that type of behavioral analytics across an entire environment without having to put an agent on every single system? So I think that this is fantastic. And like you said, I haven't seen ForScale being used, but they're saying all of the right things. And I think that they're actually moving in the right direction as far as where security as a whole needs to move.
But then they say, think of ForScale as your personal AI-powered risk robot, able to consume huge amounts of log data and provide instant insights on emerging threats.
And I think that's what happens whenever you have the engineering team try to explain to the marketing team what it is that's going on. And the marketing team writes it down on a napkin, and then they run with it because everybody wants.
I think the issue that I have, and the reason it does products such as ForScale, and we've seen other vendors run into this trouble too, is they're mixing a bunch of algorithms together, or not algorithms, but terminology together, and it really doesn't make sense. AI and machine learning are two totally different things. Anomaly detection is something that you might get as a result of machine learning. So they're just like mixing all these terms together. And I think the end result is we still don't know what problem they solve and why they solve it better than another vendor, which is kind of my theme for this week's news.
There's the key. I think that's one of the themes that you're going to continue to keep hitting on the show. And I think it's a good theme whenever you're a vendor. What is the problem? What are you doing to solve that problem? And what is your differentiator within that space? And if we go back to the previous one where they were talking about next generation AV, what is the problem they're trying to solve? How are they actually trying to approach that problem in a unique way?
Right.
The only thing that I like about this one from a tech geek is I love behavioral analytics. Anytime someone starts talking about AI and machine learning and those things, I get all kinds of excited for obvious reasons. But I think that what's missing from this is how are they doing it fundamentally different than a lot of the other vendors that are out there. And I also don't think that they actually list out what the actual problem is. The first two paragraphs are all about how awesome their product is. Third paragraph is about how awesome their product is. And then the fourth product they have to illustrate why automated risk detection is becoming increasingly important. I think that probably should have been what they led out with. What is the problem statement, and then the solutions behind it.
Well, and I think that it's interesting. The problem statement for EUBA is you've got this SIM, and it's not telling you which user accounts are being abused, and that's what spawned the growth of this UBA market space. And now I think we've reached a point where we got to determine, like we said before, either it's going to be built into SIM, or technologies are going to include UBA that's going to replace SIM, or it's going to sit somewhere else in your security strategy outside of SIM. It's interesting how we've seen everyone from vulnerability management vendors start doing all this log stuff now. And then we've seen people do it on the endpoint, and then we've seen people also go do it on the network. So being able to collect all this information and tell me, right? I mean, basically, all these products in these various spaces, in this kind of somewhat narrow niche, should solve the problem of, you've got a machine or a device on your network that has been compromised by bad guys, or you have a user account, some credentials that are being abused or have been taken over by bad guys. We need to know those things, right? The problem is I might have those things in my network and I don't know it, and those pose risk to my entire organization. And there are hundreds of vendors that are looking to solve this problem, most of which in a different, a couple of major categories of different ways in which they solve it. But I think it's interesting to watch, this space kind of evolve and grow and shift. And I'm just curious, where we end up. Are we going to end up in a place where there's a core set of functionality in your security program that's identifying bad machines and identifying bad user accounts, and how we accomplish that I think is really interesting. Gets in your point, John, of AI and machine learning.
Well, and the other thing that's been interesting about this is you talk about this being a core functionality. And what I find interesting is we're seeing some of the big vendors like Splunk and ArcSight. We're not seeing them talk a lot about what they're doing in this space. I don't see those posts. I don't see those blogs. I don't see those press releases. And why is that? Why don't we see these vendors that are already in the SIM space and have massive SIM installations kind of basically touting what they're doing in this space? Because I know, if you look at QRadar, they have this capability. I think Splunk also has this capability. ArcSight does as well. But I think that it kind of shows where their marketing isn't quite up to snuff, because all these other vendors can come in and say that they're doing these behavioral analytics, they can machine learning and all this crap. And I can just see how that's going to be starting to eat into the big boys' pie a little bit more as we move forward into the future. So I don't know why we're not seeing more from the big vendors, is kind of my point.
I agree. The SANS community has released their best of vendors report, John. And I'm kind of curious what, I'm not sure you had any involvement in it, but the Best of 2016 awards was announced. Interesting, some of the winners. Cylance won for Best Endpoint Protection. Interesting how Qualys WAS won for Application Security. One of our favorites and sponsors within our network is Logarithm, of course, won for Best SIM. I'm not sure. I think this was based on a user poll. I don't know what questions were asked of the audience, but I find it interesting that some of my hands-on experience may contradict what some of these awards are going to. And I mean, let's say Qualys, for example. I mean, I'm not saying Qualys is a bad product, but their web application scanner, I found there's much better solutions on the market today to solve that problem. So I'm not quite sure how that kind of came into play. SANS is also a sponsor as well. We should disclose of other shows on the network. But and John and I have had a long relationship with SANS and still to this day. So I thought it was interesting. You wanted to get your take on some of the winners in the process.
So let's go through each of these. I think the winner for vulnerability assessment is Tenable. I don't think we'd argue that point. Threat intelligence, CrowdStrike, Falcon Intelligence. Maybe. I see them used a lot, and I could see how people would like that. Palo Alto for next generation firewall. I think that they have a large user base, and a lot of people are very happy. But I think we've also seen Cisco Firepower starting to get very, very, very good very quickly.
Yeah.
Application security, it's a web application firewall or web application security. I don't know. I personally like Veracode, but that's a weird one. I think that one, Paul, is a large enough edge case that just a few votes could actually tilt it one way or the other.
True.
Endpoint detection, we're looking at Carbon Black. I don't think we would argue with that at all, because Carbon Black is awesome. FireEye for advanced threat detection. I think that they've done a lot better over the past 12 months since Tavis went after them. And SIM, Logarithm, of course, is an interesting one as well. So I think that's pretty cool. But I do want to talk about the Cylance Protect one. This has been something that BHIS has been kind of on the cutting edge of basically talking about Cylance Protect over the past week. And I need to make it very, very clear that I agree with this. I do think that Cylance Protect is the best endpoint protection product that's out there. Whenever you compare it with traditional antivirus, when you compare it with a lot of the other competitors that are in this space, Cylance Protect is one of the most mature, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have problems. And I think that what we see is we start to see a huge skew between what a vendor says that their product can do and the reality of that product. And Cylance has their unbelievable tool where they drop 30 bits of malware on the system and it detects and stops every single one of them. And that's neat, but when we're testing it in a real scenario, a handful of really, really basic bypass techniques are getting around it. It's still better than traditional blacklisting AV by a wide margin, but it still has growth. It still has some things that it needs to do better without question moving forward. So a lot of these I do agree with. It's right in line with what I see my students and what they think are the best products. It's right in line with a number of the products that we would recommend at BHIS. And it's also in line, in a large part, with a lot of the products we talk about, and some of them being sponsors on the show as well. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Let's see. Oh, I want to talk about along those lines, and it's good that we can vet some of those results from the SANS Institute. And of course, it's an organization we greatly respect. Although I still disagree with the Qualys WAS thing. I think there's a lot. Well, there's different ways to skin that cat too. So it probably depended on how they asked the question as well. So, I've noticed a trend this month. There's kind of, in my estimation, a little lull in product announcements. Right, because we're kind of coming off RSA, and anyone that had an announcement either made it before RSA, at RSA, or shortly thereafter. you saw that trickle, and now we're in kind of like that lull period between RSA and Black Hat for big announcements. And what a lot of the vendors are doing are either surveying people and asking them questions and distilling back survey results, or they're using a third party to do that, but they're funding that survey. Then they're also doing analysis of their own data, right? Basically versions of the Verizon data breach report. What you have to keep in mind is I find all of these survey, or most of them, I'm sure there are some that aren't influenced in some way, they're really slanted towards the vendor. And I think you need to look at these surveys with, definitely a grain of salt. And this one, and the headlines is what like they use to draw you in, but you have to really question it. For example, when they say new research reveals that 30% of malware attacks are zero-day exploits, I'm like, that doesn't make sense. That caught my attention. I'm like malware that's running around typically doesn't use a 0 day, because then it's not going to be a 0 day much longer because someone's going to discover it, right? So to have that high percentage of malware using 0 day attacks, I've never seen that. I thought it was weird. What they really mean by a 0 day attack are malicious software or malware that can evade detection of endpoint protection technology. They're calling that like a 0 day attack, when that's completely not true. Obviously, there's I don't think there is or ever will be a conclusive study about who's evading what and in what state that's in, because everything is moving so fast. And then there's the whole problem of regression testing. It's just a moving target, I think, when it comes to antivirus and endpoint protection. What's your take on that, John, in terms of the whole survey thing, the whole, doing some research and presenting data? I think we really got to ask a lot of questions when we read this kind of stuff.
So the survey portion of it, that you're going to get that, right? You're going to get people answering surveys however they see them. But the problem is, I think, kind of echoing what you said, is their definition of 0 day is so off kilter from any other definition of a 0 day that it makes it exceedingly difficult to understand or read or comprehend exactly what they're talking about for the rest of the article. Because it's not that high of a percentage are 0 days. It just isn't. There's just no way it's that high. You and I both know that. Especially whenever you look at today's
it's probably higher than 30% of the malware that's out there that's bypassing endpoint protection and antivirus.
And I would agree with that, but that's a really, really horrid definition of a 0 day. And I think, a 0 day is a exploit that triggers a vulnerability that has been previously unknown. And if you're talking about bypass techniques, well, that's far more interesting, right? That's probably what this report is talking about.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to go through the rest of the report just because of that, when we're dealing with the language being so far off from the normal language that's being used in the community.
Absolutely. This one came from WatchGuard, I think. Yeah. And we've seen that in the industry a lot, where network defense kind of picks on some of the shortcomings of endpoint protection. Endpoint protection kind of does the same thing. Of course, in your security strategy, you need both. I mean, that's just the way it is, right? I mean, you have to have an encompassing security program, and don't get caught up in comparing one technology to the other, but think of them as complementary to each other rather than in competition with each other. So,
exactly.
And I'm not saying WatchGuard did this, but some people might interpret it as, well, that means I need to put more stock in my firewall and network technologies and not really care as much about endpoint. You probably should care about those equally, right? But understand that the shortcomings of one just means you need to have a more comprehensive program with all these technologies, people, process, and technology in the mix for your security program. So,
agreed.
I'm going to talk more about that tonight, I think, on Paul's Security Weekly. There are some other surveys that were just clearly slanted, and I'm like, you're not even really telling me anything. So,
yeah.
Alrighty. With that, we're going to take a short break, come back, talk about configuration management. Stay tuned.